They had crossed the Atlantic not as soldiers anymore, but as prisoners of a war they had lost. For many of these young German men, the last thing they remembered of Europe was the cold smell of diesel and the echo of bombers over Hamburg. Now, as the ship's foghorn sounded off the American coast, they saw something they could hardly understand. A skyline that wasn't ruined, a sky without searchlights, and soldiers who smiled instead of shouting. More than 370,000. German prisoners of war were transported to the United States between 1943 and 1946. They came from captured U-boat crews, the Afrika Korps, and units defeated in France and Italy. Their destination, quiet camps spread across the American heartland, Texas, Alabama, Nebraska, and even the farmlands of Iowa. At first, most expected cruelty. Nazi propaganda had warned them that capture by the Americans meant torture or starvation. But when they stepped onto the docks, they were handed cigarettes. Some even received apples, bread, and cups of coffee. It was the first small crack in their understanding of the enemy. The train ride inland was long and strange. They passed endless rows of farms, fields untouched by bombs, and small towns with children waving as the military convoys rolled by. To some of the men, this felt like another planet, a world where the war barely existed. When they reached the camps, they were shocked again. Each camp had barracks, a canteen, clean showers, and medical facilities. Rules were strict but not cruel. The guards were young Americans, many not much older than the prisoners themselves. And the biggest surprise came at mealtime. The German POWs couldn't believe what they were being served. Ice cream, sometimes twice a week. Fresh bread every morning. Coca-Cola in glass bottles. The same drink that many had seen only in American magazines before the war. Some thought it was a trick. Others wrote in secret diaries that they felt ashamed. Ashamed that their enemy fed them better than their own army had fed civilians back home. Inside the camps, daily life followed the Geneva Convention closely. They worked on nearby farms, played soccer, learned English, and even formed orchestras and theatre groups. Red Cross inspectors reported consistently high standards. In some camps, Christmas dinners included turkey, mashed potatoes, and dessert. A former Luftwaffe pilot later wrote, "America treated us like human beings. It was confusing. We could not hate them after that." The irony was bitter. While Europe burned, the men who had helped fight that war were now tasting peace for the first time. At night, some POWs lay awake listening to the faint sound of American radio shows, Bing Crosby's voice, the laughter of variety programs, and the jingles advertising soap and chocolate bars. They couldn't understand why the enemy seemed so normal, so full of life. For these men, the war was far away now, but every Coca-Cola bottle, every bowl of ice cream, was a reminder that the world they had been told to hate was perhaps not what they thought it was. Life inside the American prisoner of war camps soon settled into a rhythm that few of the Germans had expected. The days began with the sound of a bugle, a roll call, and the soft hum of trucks outside the wire. There was no shouting, no abuse, just order, routine, and a strange kind of quiet. Work became the center of their days. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be assigned to non-military labor, and thousands were sent to nearby farms or factories. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, and chopped lumber in the Pacific Northwest. For every day's work, they earned small credits redeemable in the camp canteen, where they could buy cigarettes, soap, or sometimes even candy bars. Many of them discovered that American farmers treated them with a degree of respect that was disarming. One POW later recalled how an elderly woman brought him lemonade on a hot afternoon, saying only, "You're someone's son, too." Moments like these blurred the lines between enemy and neighbor. Back in camp, education flourished. The US Army encouraged self-improvement, partly to prevent unrest and partly as a gesture of democracy in action. Soon, makeshift classrooms appeared inside the barracks. Engineers taught mathematics, teachers organized language courses, and artists held drawing sessions. For men who had known only war, Books became a quiet salvation. Sport was another lifeline. Soccer fields were laid out, and inter-camp tournaments drew crowds of cheering prisoners and amused American guards. Music echoed from rehearsal halls built out of scrap wood. One camp orchestra even performed Beethoven's symphonies for visiting Red Cross officials, earning applause from both sides of the wire. Not all prisoners adjusted easily. Some struggled with guilt, wondering how their families were surviving amid the ruins of Germany. Letters arrived months late, often censored or blacked out. But the food remained steady, the guards remained calm, and gradually even the most suspicious men began to lower their defenses. The camp canteens became cultural crossroads. American soldiers introduced chewing gum and baseball, while the Germans shared recipes for rye bread and potato soup. On rare Sundays, guards joined in soccer matches, laughing together under the open sky. It was still captivity, but it was also a glimpse of humanity's better side. Psychologists who later studied these camps noted that many prisoners underwent a quiet transformation. Propaganda had painted the Allies as monsters, yet here they were, discovering the freedom to speak, to read, even to debate politics without fear. The fences remained, but mentally, many of them were already stepping beyond them. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, most POWs had spent months or even years inside these American compounds. They had become part of local economies, part of rural life itself, and for some, the idea of returning to Germany was not filled with joy, but with uncertainty. What waited beyond the fences now felt far less stable than the world within. For the American guards too, the experience left its mark. Many wrote later that they had learned more about ordinary Germans during those years than any newspaper had ever told them. Mutual respect, born out of simple daily coexistence, had replaced the hatred of war propaganda. When the gates finally opened and the prisoners were sent home, they left behind more than their uniforms. They left a strange peace that had been born inside the barbed wire. It was an experiment in decency during a brutal age, one that neither side would easily forget. For many prisoners, the only connection to home came in the form of thin envelopes. Letters that crossed the Atlantic months late, their words censored, their ink faded from too many hands. Every letter was both a comfort and a wound. Some spoke of family still alive, others brought silence in place of names. The American postal system ran efficiently, but nothing could bridge the emotional distance between the barbed wire of the camps and the ruins of Cologne, Dresden, or Berlin. Men who had arrived in uniform now read of homes that no longer existed. Entire streets were gone, cities reduced to numbers on radio bulletins. The news travelled slowly through whispers. Rumours passed from one camp to another. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Paris was liberated. And one winter night, a guard confirmed what many already feared. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. Silence followed. No cheers, no anger, just the hollow stillness of men who no longer belonged anywhere. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the ground, unable to imagine what home meant anymore. The American guards treated the moment with respect. There were no celebrations inside the fences that week. Commanders ordered radios turned low, and some camps even organized brief church services where both captors and captives prayed for an end to the suffering. As the war ended in Europe, the camps began to change. Some prisoners were transferred to help rebuild devastated regions in France and Britain. Others stayed in the United States months longer, awaiting repatriation ships that were slow to arrive. The food rations were reduced slightly, but the dignity of treatment remained. For many, the waiting was harder than the war itself. They had grown accustomed to the rhythm of camp life, to the predictability, the safety, even the quiet kindness of their guards. Now uncertainty replaced routine. Would they be punished back home? Would anyone still be waiting for them? Letters from Germany were shorter now and more desperate. "Do not come home yet," one mother wrote. "There is nothing left." Some men folded those letters carefully and placed them inside uniform pockets. as if the paper itself were something sacred. Among the prisoners, new divisions formed. Former officers still clung to ideology, refusing to believe the radio broadcasts that described Germany's collapse. But the younger men, those who had seen the farms, the food, the freedom of America, they began to question everything they had been taught. What if all along the war had been for lies? Psychologists visiting the camps noted a visible shift in morale. Bitterness gave way to reflection. The men talked not of revenge but of rebuilding. Some asked to stay in America, offering to work as farmers or carpenters, rather than return to the ruins of their homeland. Few were allowed to, but the request itself said everything about how the war had changed them. When the first ships finally departed from New York and Boston, the docks were lined with guards waving farewell. The prisoners boarded quietly, their belongings packed in canvas bags, their hearts heavy with gratitude and loss. One man wrote in his diary before leaving, "We came here as enemies, but we return as something else. Perhaps not friends, but no longer strangers." The voyage home was nothing like the journey to America. This time there were no cigarettes, no laughter from the guards, and no promises waiting on the other side of the ocean. The German prisoners crowded the decks of grey transport ships, their eyes fixed on the horizon as Europe came back into view. When the ports of Bremen and Hamburg finally appeared, many could not recognize them. The once proud harbors were mountains of twisted steel, their cranes toppled, their warehouses burnt shells. The men had left a nation, they returned to rubble. British and American officers supervised their disembarkation, handing out identification papers and meager food rations. There were no flags, no families waiting, only silence and the slow shuffle of men walking toward uncertainty. The shock was overwhelming. In America, they had lived within order, clean camps, steady meals, routine. Here, there was chaos. Refugees wandered with suitcases and hollow eyes. Children scavenged among ruins for coal and bread crusts. The men realized that captivity had been easier than freedom. Some tried to find their homes, following half-destroyed street signs and fragments of memory. Others discovered that entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by piles of bricks and empty lots. Mothers, wives, sisters, many had vanished in bombings or evacuations. The Allied authorities established rehabilitation centers for returning POWs, where they were screened for their political affiliations and health. Most were cleared quickly, but a few who had held Nazi ranks faced interrogations and temporary detention. For the majority, the hardest part was not the questioning, it was the realization that their old lives no longer existed. As the months passed, the former prisoners were absorbed into a society struggling to rebuild itself from dust. They traded their US camp work for German reconstruction, clearing debris, repairing bridges, planting the first crops of a new era. The American rations they once took for granted were now distant memories. Bread was rationed, milk scarce, and coal nearly impossible to find. Many of them wrote to their American guards or farm hosts, letters filled with gratitude and longing. Some even received packages: soap, coffee, chocolate, sometimes a photograph of the places they had worked. It was proof that kindness had survived the war, but not all could adapt. A number of returning POWs faced suspicion from fellow Germans, accused of being Americanized, too soft, too friendly toward the former enemy. They struggled between two worlds, the one they had known before 1943 and the one they had seen behind the fences of American decency. One diary found decades later captured the feeling simply: "We were prisoners in America, but we felt free. Now we are free in Germany, but everything feels like a prison." As Reconstruction accelerated, many of these men became silent witnesses to the moral collapse that had preceded the war. They built new homes, raised families, and rarely spoke of the strange years they had spent in the land of Coca-Cola and ice cream. Yet deep inside, the contrast remained, a private measure of what civilization could look like when mercy replaced hate. And so, the war ended not in a parade, but in a quiet reckoning across both continents. For the Americans, it was a lesson in compassion during victory. For the Germans, it was a lifetime of reflection on what it meant to be treated as human beings by those they were taught to despise. In the years after the war, silence spread across both oceans. Germany was rebuilding, America was moving on, and the memories of the prisoner of war camps faded quietly into history. But beneath that silence, something remarkable had begun to grow. Friendship. Letters continued to cross the Atlantic, written in hesitant English and careful German. Former prisoners thanked American guards for kindness, farmers for their patience, and families for the small gestures that had given them dignity when all else was lost. One letter from a former prisoner read simply, "Your wife gave me coffee when the world gave me guns. I will never forget that." By the early 1950s, a few of those men returned, not in uniform, but in civilian clothes, holding immigration papers instead of prisoner tags. They came back to the same farmlands where they had once worked as captives, this time as free men eager to start new lives. In Texas, Nebraska, and Minnesota, farmers welcomed them like old friends. Some had kept the very tools the POWs once used, stored in barns as reminders of strange days when enemies had plowed fields together. Many of the returning men brought gifts, wood carvings, letters of thanks, even small coins minted from melted German medals. It wasn't just sentiment, it was transformation. The war had forced two worlds to meet. And in that unlikely meeting, humanity had taken root. One American farmer told a reporter, "They worked hard, they laughed, and when the war ended, we realized they were just boys who wanted to live." His former prisoner later became godfather to his son. For others, the connection was through faith. Chaplains who had ministered to POWs kept in touch for decades, sharing Bibles, wedding photos, and stories of rebirth. In some towns, small memorials were built, not to celebrate war, but to remember a peace born behind the wire. Historians would later call it one of the quietest reconciliations of the 20th century. There were no treaties or parades, only handshakes, shared meals, and the slow rebuilding of trust between two nations that had once sought to destroy each other. For the German men who returned, America represented something larger than geography. It was a mirror of what their homeland might become. A place where democracy did not mean weakness, and compassion did not mean surrender. They carried that lesson back into post-war Europe, teaching their children that the enemy was not always who they were told to hate. Some became teachers, craftsmen, and writers. Others became advocates for peace, warning new generations about the seduction of ideology and the importance of dignity, even in defeat. By the 1970s, the first reunions took place. Old men gathered with their former guards on American soil, this time embracing, laughing, sometimes crying. They brought faded photographs of their youth, proof that humanity had survived the madness of war. One man said during an interview, "War taught us to kill, captivity taught us to live." It was a sentence that summed up the entire chapter of the German POWs in America. A story not of battles or medals, but of redemption through ordinary decency. And long after the barbed wire was gone, the memories remained, carried quietly across generations. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the hearts that choose to forgive. Today, most Americans drive past them without knowing. Cornfields, warehouses, or quiet stretches of forest now cover the land where once tens of thousands of German soldiers lived behind barbed wire. There were more than 420 prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States. Some stood near small railroad towns, others beside dusty highways or quiet rivers. Each was a world unto itself, a fragment of Europe transplanted into the heart of America. Local residents still remember faint traces: a concrete foundation in Kansas, an abandoned guard tower in Georgia, an old water tank in the woods of Wisconsin, the evidence of war hidden beneath decades of peace. During the 1940s, these camps had been busy places. Trucks rumbled through with food and supplies. Farmers arrived early, signing work papers for the German laborers. And on Sunday afternoons, the faint sound of music sometimes drifted from behind the fences. Violins, accordions, and voices singing in German. Many of the local children had never met foreigners before. To them, the prisoners seemed exotic, mysterious. They would sneak to the edges of the fence to wave, and sometimes a POW would toss them a carved toy or a wooden bird made from scrap. For the townspeople, the war felt both distant and strangely personal. When the war ended and the camps emptied, the government dismantled the barracks, sold off the lumber, and erased the sites from official maps. The fields were replanted, the fences buried or melted down, but for years afterward, strange souvenirs kept surfacing. A spoon stamped US Army, a button with German lettering, a diary buried in a tin box. Historians have since pieced together these forgotten geographies of captivity. They discovered that the camps had quietly reshaped the American landscape, introducing cultural exchanges in places that had never seen immigrants before. German words slipped into local slang, recipes found their way into community cookbooks, and towns once defined by isolation began to feel connected to a wider world. Some of those towns built memorials decades later, not grand monuments but small plaques beside schools or libraries, in memory of the German prisoners who labored here, 1944-1946. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a way of saying that even in war, decency had left its mark, yet most of these camps have vanished completely. Nature reclaimed what history forgot. Wild grass grows over the paths where soldiers once marched in formation. The wind moves through broken fence posts that no longer hold anything back. Only the old photographs, faded and yellowed, bear witness to the strange intersection of enemies and empathy that once existed there. One local historian in Alabama once said, "The barbed wire is gone, but the memory still hums beneath the soil." And perhaps that is true, because the story of the POW camps is not about punishment or victory, but about endurance, the endurance of humanity under the weight of war, and the endurance of memory long after the fences disappeared. When the war ended, most of the German prisoners returned home quietly, but their ideas did not. What they had seen in America, the freedom, the order, the respect for the individual, stayed with them long after the fences disappeared. In classrooms, in workshops, in rebuilding towns across Germany, many of them began to teach lessons that had nothing to do with military strategy. They spoke about fairness, about tolerance, about how a strong nation could also be a kind one. They had lived through both extremes, tyranny and democracy, and their voices carried the weight of experience. Former officers who once commanded units now taught in trade schools. Some became architects of the new West German Republic, advocating for systems that valued human rights and open debate. Others returned to farming, quietly applying what they had learned from the American countryside. Efficiency, cooperation, and dignity in labor. In small towns, returning POWs formed reading circles and discussion groups. They brought back English books, translated them, and introduced neighbors to ideas they had never encountered before. It was a quiet revolution, one that spread through words, not weapons. For many young Germans born after the war, these men became the first bridge between the old world and the new. They taught that power without humanity was hollow, that strength was measured not by conquest, but by compassion. Some even returned to universities in the United States on scholarships decades later, their pasts unknown to classmates who saw only curious foreign students eager to learn. They sat in the same classrooms where the ideals of freedom had once been abstract, now deeply personal truths. American professors who had served during the war sometimes recognized the accent, the hesitation before certain words, and instead of judgment, there was understanding. Two generations quietly acknowledging what the other had survived. By the 1960s, several of these former POWs helped shape new cultural exchanges between West Germany and the United States. Student exchange programs, sister city projects, and art collaborations grew from the friendships once born behind barbed wire. The same men who had once been labeled enemies were now hosting American students in rebuilt towns, offering them food, laughter, and a place to stay. Their homes became classrooms of living memory. The children of both nations learned not from history books, but from the men who had lived it, men who had seen humanity at its worst and still chosen to believe in its best. One former prisoner, now a teacher in Bavaria, often ended his lectures with the same words: "I was captured by America's soldiers, but freed by its kindness. It was not propaganda. It was the truth spoken softly from experience." The same kindness that once arrived as coffee, music, and fair treatment had become the seed of an entire generation's moral rebirth. And so, the war's aftermath became more than a story of defeat and occupation. It became a story of education. The education of a nation that had once followed orders blindly, now learning to think freely. Time softened the edges of memory, but it never erased them. For decades after the war, the stories of the German prisoners in America survived quietly in photo albums, diaries, and whispered family conversations. Children of the guards grew up hearing tales of the polite Germans who worked on their family farms. Children of the prisoners grew up hearing about a strange land where even enemies were treated with respect. And together, across two continents, they carried pieces of the same memory. A shared reminder that decency could survive even in the shadow of destruction. In post-war Germany, those stories became a kind of folklore. A son would listen to his father describing ice cream in a desert camp in Texas, or Coca-Cola on a hot day in Alabama, and shake his head in disbelief. How could such kindness exist during a time of war? In America, meanwhile, the memory faded into nostalgia. For many small towns, the camps had become just another footnote of local history. But every so often, a new generation rediscovered them. A teacher unearthing photographs for a school project, a farmer finding a carved wooden toy while tilling the soil, a journalist tracing names in an old ledger labelled Camp Ruston, Camp Algona, Camp Hearn. Each rediscovery brought the past back to life. It reminded Americans that even in victory, they had chosen restraint over revenge. And it reminded Germans that dignity, once offered freely, could rebuild trust that politics had destroyed. By the late 20th century, documentaries and local museums began to appear. Small, humble exhibits with faded letters, Red Cross forms, and canteen menus. Visitors would pause in front of a black and white photo. A group of smiling young men in identical uniforms, holding ice cream cones. The caption read simply, "German POWs, Texas, 1944. And people would whisper, "It doesn't look like war at all." The legacy of those camps rippled far beyond their fences. They influenced how future conflicts would handle prisoners, how nations would define humanity even in the midst of chaos. Their lessons shaped international law and inspired generations of peacekeepers who believed that justice could coexist with mercy. Among historians, the POW experience became a rare example of moral endurance. It proved that compassion was not weakness, that treating the enemy as human could yield something stronger than any weapon: respect. And so, the echoes continued. In classrooms, films, and family stories, the tale of the German prisoners in America became more than history. It became a mirror for every generation that followed, a reflection of what happens when humanity prevails where hatred was expected. In that reflection, we see not just the faces of young men behind wire fences, but the beginning of something larger, a fragile but enduring belief that even in war, we can still choose to be kind. The war between nations had long ended, but another battle continued, a quieter one, fought not with weapons, but with memory. In the decades that followed 1945, history itself became contested ground. Governments built monuments to victory, Armies wrote their own legends, and propaganda slowly reshaped the past. Yet within that noise, the story of the German prisoners in America refused to disappear. It lived on in the words of those who had been there. Farmers who remembered smiles through the fence, guards who remembered the strange courtesy of their captives, and prisoners who remembered the taste of freedom in a place they had expected to fear. For many veterans on both sides, that memory became a shield against bitterness. They had seen humanity survive where it had every reason to die, and they carried that truth into a world that was learning to divide itself again. The Cold War, new borders, new fears. Historians later called it the moral counterattack, a movement of remembrance that challenged the cynicism of the modern age. Each time the story of cruelty resurfaced in new wars, these men and women offered another example, quiet but powerful, that mercy could exist even in uniform. In schools and universities, lecturers began to teach this part of the war as a case study in ethics. The POW camps became metaphors, not for captivity, but for how people define the limits of their conscience. American students were surprised to learn that compassion had once been military policy. German students were moved to realize that their fathers and grandfathers had been seen as humans, not monsters. In that understanding, a new generation began to see the true meaning of victory. It was not the destruction of an enemy, but the preservation of what makes us human in the face of destruction. The decisive battle was never fought on the fields of Europe, but in the minds of those who chose to remember honestly. The guards who refused cruelty, the prisoners who admitted their shame, the families who kept writing letters across oceans long after the war was done. And every time one of them told their story, the barbed wire dissolved a little more. Each memory became a weapon against indifference, a defense against the return of dehumanization. One historian once wrote, "The real victory of World War II was not military, it was moral. That victory was measured not by captured cities, but by the small acts of mercy that refused to die." When we look back now, the lesson is clear. War reveals what nations are capable of, but peace reveals what they are made of. And in the quiet landscapes of forgotten camps, the world discovered that compassion can be stronger than ideology, and kindness can leave the longest shadow of all. When the last prisoner boarded his ship, the fences stood empty under the sun. Wind moved through the open gates, and silence filled the barracks that once echoed with music, laughter, and longing. The war was over, but something remained behind. Not just the foundations of old camps, but the invisible threads of decency that had connected enemies across a continent. In America's farmlands, traces of that unlikely brotherhood lingered for years. A wooden cross left in a field in Texas, a name carved into a bunk post in Minnesota, a small note hidden under a chapel bench. Danke, for letting us feel human again. Farmers found small carvings in barns, tiny ships, birds, and initials cut into beams. For some, they became family heirlooms, passed down as reminders of a strange time when war and peace had shared the same sky. In the towns where the camps once stood, life moved on. New houses were built, roads paved, and the next generation played where soldiers had once stood guard. But deep in the archives of county courthouses, ledgers still bear their names, lists of men who harvested, who taught, who sang, and who quietly changed the meaning of the word enemy. For the former prisoners who returned home, America never truly left them. Its taste of fairness, its rhythm of daily respect, became part of their inner compass. Some painted the landscapes they remembered, vast fields and endless skies free of ruins. Others wrote memoirs, not of battle, but of kindness. The historians who later uncovered their stories were often struck by the same paradox: how the act of imprisonment had become a lesson in freedom. Within those fences, they had discovered the value of choice, of mercy, of self-reflection. It was a reversal so profound that it rewrote the moral geography of the war itself. For Americans, too, there was legacy. Many guards left the camps with changed hearts. They had looked their enemies in the eyes and seen not monsters, but frightened boys trying to understand the world that had devoured them. It made future wars harder to justify. It made peace easier to imagine. Years later, when veterans returned to those quiet places, they found only grass and trees where the barracks had once stood. But some swore they could still feel it. The faint hum of memory in the air. The ghost of laughter in a language long forgiven. That was what they had left behind. Not ruins or resentment, but a living testament that even amid destruction, humanity had refused to surrender. History remembers battles by their victories, but the heart remembers them by their lessons. The story of the German prisoners in America is not about conquest or surrender. It is about what people chose to do when no one was watching. When power was theirs to abuse, some chose restraint. When hatred could have been easy, they chose understanding. Those small choices, made in kitchens, in fields, in dusty campyards, became ripples that spread far beyond their time. They reshaped how two nations saw each other, and how future generations would define what it means to win. For the Americans who guarded the camps, the experience revealed something rarely spoken, that victory without cruelty was possible, that the moral measure of a nation was not its might, but its mercy. For the Germans who lived behind those fences, the experience became an education in humility. They had been told they were fighting for civilization, but in America, they discovered what civilization truly meant: fairness, order, dignity. Many later said that they learned democracy not from speeches, but from the way they were treated as prisoners. It was an irony that history could not have scripted better, that freedom was taught inside captivity. And as the decades passed, the meaning of that irony deepened. Because in every era since, the world has faced new wars, new hatreds, new walls. Yet the example remains, quiet, steady, undeniable, proof that compassion can outlast fear. The lesson is simple, but never easy. War is not just about what nations do to each other, but what people do with their power, how they treat the defeated, how they choose to remember the fallen, and whether they let the darkness of the past define the light of their future. In those forgotten camps of the 1940s, the world glimpsed a different kind of strength, the strength to be kind. That strength does not fade with time. It lives on in the descendants who meet at memorials, in the teachers who retell these stories, and in anyone who still believes that peace is built one act of decency at a time. The last witnesses of that war are almost gone now. The camps have vanished, the letters have yellowed, and the voices that once echoed through the fences have faded into the quiet of time. Yet something remains. It lingers not in monuments or medals, but in the invisible spaces between generations, a kind of inherited gentleness, born from the memory of what mercy once looked like. In small American towns, the wind still passes over fields where prisoners once worked. Nobody sees them anymore, but the soil remembers. And across the ocean, descendants in Germany still speak softly of a country that fed their fathers when their own could not. History books will list the great battles, Normandy, Stalingrad, the Bulge, but they rarely speak of the quiet places where humanity held its ground, where the war paused for a moment and ordinary people chose compassion over vengeance. That silence is its own victory. It is the sound of conscience winning against chaos. It is the echo that endures long after the guns have gone cold. For every act of cruelty and war, there exists a moment like this. A cup of coffee offered to a prisoner, a guard who looks away from hate, a song shared through barbed wire. Small things, easily forgotten, yet powerful enough to change the course of memory itself. When the storm of war passed, what was left was not the machinery of destruction, but the fragile proof that kindness had survived. And in that proof lies the true legacy of those years, that empathy, once given, becomes eternal. So the story ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with stillness, a silence heavy with meaning, the sound of lessons carried forward, the sound of the world remembering what it means to be human.